A couple of weeks ago, we looked at some of those great human questions that all human beings ask, if you'll remember, when we did the Mass. I call them the great questions or the fundamental questions. So where do we come from? Where are we going? What's wrong with us? What's the solution? Why are we here? And all human beings ask those great questions. And in the end, I think that there is a fundamental choice we have to make in life. And the fundamental choice is this. Am I ultimately all alone in this universe? And does death have the last word? Or is there something more, something greater than everything I see in front of me that is transitory and passing? So, and how I answer that question is really kind of fundamental. So, I believe that there's nothing beyond this world. It's all up to me in a sense. I'm going to live my life a certain way. But the question becomes, is there something bigger and greater? And the most primitive human cultures all around the planet have always had an awareness that there's something that they would call the numinous or the holy. Sometimes they identified it with things like a great forest or the ocean or a storm or a mountain. And most of our primitive human ancestors, not all, but most of them, were what we would call today polytheistic. They believed that the divine was manifested in many different kinds of ways. So there might be a god of a forest and a god of a mountain and so forth. But they had this sense that there was something bigger and greater, that which is holy in the world. And Rudolf Ott, the great German philosopher of religion, he talked about the idea of the sacred or holy as having two elements to it, which we're going to look at tonight. One of them, he said, was an element that was attractive, fascinating, that drew us to the mystery. And another dimension of it that was awe-inspiring. I shouldn't get too close. This mystery is much bigger than me, much greater. So that sense of that dynamic of drawn to something greater, and then at the same time, a certain awe, reverence, and respect towards such a holy mystery. So, you know, all of us have to fundamentally answer the question, do we believe in anything greater than what we see in front of us or not? And it's a personal thing that requires on our part what we call an act of faith, because that which is beyond this world, though we have evidence or signs, can never be definitively proven. So there was an element of trust and faith. And one of the things that we always have to ask ourselves as we're walking through the days of our lives in this world is this world that we're living in, is it fundamentally good? And is it fundamentally trustworthy? And how we answer that question is also fundamental. Is this a good universe I'm living in? Is this fundamentally a good life? And is reality trustworthy? So the fundamental question for the human person is, am I going to trust? Or will, in the end, will I live as if I don't trust in the reality that is around me and the deeper dimension of that reality? So tonight, every year that I do this, I approach the topic a bit differently. But tonight, after that kind of initial thought process that I kind of invited you to sort of enter, I want to start with a very vivid narrative in the book of Exodus. So what's the setting? The setting is in the story of God's people as it unfolds. God's people have ended up in slavery in Egypt. So this small little band of slaves, the Hebrews, are descendants of Joseph, of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the great patriarchs. And now they're in Egypt, they're enslaved, and they're suffering greatly. And there is, at the time, an effort on the part of the Egyptians to make their life bitterly cruel and to kill the Israelites off. So when baby boys were born, they were trying to slaughter them. So a little Hebrew boy is born who will be named Moses, and he is placed into a little ark, as it were, on the water of the papyrus, and quite by accident, the daughter of Pharaoh discovers the baby crying in the basket, saves his life, and Moses is raised as an Egyptian. One day Moses is a young man walking out about, and he sees one of the Egyptian taskmasters cruelly beating a Hebrew slave. And something happens inside of him. Rises up this indignation that he is not going to let this Egyptian, and he has a sense, this is my countryman. And so what does he do? He kills the Egyptian, buries the body. The next day he goes out, and now two Hebrews are fighting between themselves. And Moses basically confronts them. Why are you doing this? You belong to the same people. And then someone says, oh, you're the one who killed the Egyptian. So Moses, what happens to Moses then? He becomes afraid, and he flees Egypt and escapes to get away. So that's the background of the story. So if you ever want to read the book of Exodus, it's a fascinating narrative. So is Genesis, which precedes it. So I want to start. Moses has gotten away from Egypt. And I'm in chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. We're going to start with verse 23. A long time passed, during which the king of Egypt died. Still, the Israelites groaned and cried out because of their slavery. As their cry for release went up to God, he heard their groaning and was mindful of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He saw the Israelites and knew. All right. Think about God for a moment. We got already 4 verbs. What were those verbs? Did you pay attention? How did God? All right. So God, he saw, right? As they cried out, he heard their groaning. He saw the Israelites. He was mindful of his covenant, and he knew. He knew. The word knew in Hebrew, yada, refers to when you know something intimately. So in the book of Genesis, Adam, it says, knew his wife Eve, and they had a baby. So intimate knowing, God knew intimately what was going on. All right, meanwhile, so that's your little introduction to the narrative. Meanwhile, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock across the desert, he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in fire, flaming out of the bush. As he looked on, he was surprised to see that the bush, though on fire, was not consumed. So Moses decided, I must go over to look at this remarkable sight and see why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw him coming over to look at it more closely, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. He answered, here I am. God said, come no nearer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. This is a sacred encounter. All right, remember what I said about Rudolf Otto about his definition of the holy? It's fascinating, it draws you to it. At the same time, it's awe-inspiring. What happens to Moses when he sees the burning bush in the desert? Immediately, he's drawn to it. This is remarkable. I've got to get to the edge here. But what happens when he gets closer? Got no closer. Take your sandals off. In the Eastern traditions, you always take your feet, your sandals and your shoes off when you're in a sacred place. So the Holy One is now here in the presence of Moses. So the Holy One in a sacred place. How many of y'all have been to the Grand Canyon? So the first time you arrive at the edge of the Grand Canyon and you look over, what happens? Wow, you're drawn. Yeah, it's like, wow, look at this. At the same time, it's kind of scary. It's scary, yeah, it's immense. It's huge. It's so immense. So when the scriptures speak about the awe of God, the fear of God, the reverence to God, it's that you get a taste of it in a place like the Grand Canyon where you're like, this is beautiful, but I don't want to get too close with it. I'm fearful I might fall in to something much bigger and more dangerous than me. So there's an element about the mystery of God that is very attractive, but also very, very awesome. Then God says, I am the God of your father, he continued, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So there's something about the holiness of God that makes Moses not want to see God. In fact, in the Old Testament, it says over and over again, no one may see the face of God and live. But in another place it says, but Moses used to talk to God as one friend does to another, face to face. So Moses in all the Old Testament is the great figure who is closest to the mystery of God. But the Lord said, now listen for verbs again. But the Lord said, I have witnessed the affliction of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry of complaint against their slave drivers. I know well what they are suffering. Therefore I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and lead them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the country of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So indeed, the cry of the Israelites has reached my ears. I have noted that the Egyptians are oppressing them. Come now, I will send you to Pharaoh to lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. All right, how many different verbs? 5 or 6? Or what did you hear? All right, I've witnessed the affliction, I've heard the cry, I know well what they're suffering, I've come down to rescue them, I've noted that they're being oppressed, the cry has reached my ears. In Hebrew, all those different verbs are used, so the English attempts to translate all those different ways that God knows something. So it's kind of like when you're a parent and your child is in great distress, you hear the cry, you see their suffering, your heart is moved, you know what's going on. You could describe as a mother or a father what happens when you see a suffering child. Your heart goes out to them. So we learn something very significant about who God is in this first kind of face-to-face encounter. What do we learn about this God? Or God is sympathetic. This is not a remote being who created the universe and then disappeared like a clockmaker creates a clock and then moves off on his own. This is a God who is intimately involved in human affairs and deeply compassionate toward human suffering. So the two words that get used about God all through the Old Testament, we'll hear over and over again that God is Hesed and Emet. When Hesed gets translated into English, you'll sometimes get it translated, God is merciful, God is loving, God is compassionate, God has pity on his people. So we tried to do the best job we can in English to translate the idea of Hesed, but Hesed is the kind of heartfelt concern. One of my professors called it heartfelt mercy. That's what Hesed is. Another way of describing it is tender compassion. The word emet is also translated sometimes true. God is compassionate and true, but the word true here is the word for faithful. So if you say, so-and-so is a true friend, he stands by me in good times and in bad. So to be emet is to be true or faithful. So these two descriptions of God come up over and over again throughout the whole Old Testament. God is a God of tender compassion, heartfelt mercy, and he is faithful to us and true, like a true friend. And that's what we see in this first dramatic encounter with the figure of Moses. The other thing that we see is that God will not just simply note or hear or understand or have compassion, but this is a God who will intervene and act on behalf of humanity. So this is a God who intervenes in the course of human history to reach out to suffering humanity. But it's interesting, how does God choose to act? What does he say? He says, "Come now, I will send you," to Moses that is, to Pharaoh, "to lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." So what does this tell us about God? It's the nature of God to enter into a partnership with us. So we do this together. We are partners with God in this adventure of liberating the human person. So when I asked you a few minutes ago about, is this universe that we're living in, do you feel it's fundamentally good? Do you trust it? Is this the kind of an ultimate reality or God that you can trust? Is it a God who cares enough and has the power to do what you need in your life done? That's one of the fundamental questions any human being is going to have to ask, right? Does this God care about us? And does God have the power to heal us or save us or liberate us from whatever slaveries we might have in life? Okay, so now what do you think Moses is going to say? Do you know the story? Yeah, I think. Moses says to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt?" And what does God say? "I will be with you. And this will be your proof that it is I who have sent you. When you bring my people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this very mountain." So Moses is saying, I'm not cut out for this kind of job. And God says, "I'm going to be with you." Moses says, "But when I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, if they ask me, what is his name, what am I to tell them?" Why is Moses wanting to know the name of God? Anybody have an idea here? Are any of you teachers in a school system? What happens when you walk into a classroom as a substitute teacher and you don't know the kid's name? They don't respect you. They go wild. Yeah, I've been a substitute teacher too. I walk into a classroom with kids, I don't know their names. I'm like, "Hey, you, over there, stop that." And they're like, I'm not going to listen to him. He doesn't know my name. But if I walk in and say, "John, put the pencil down," John drops the pencil, right? So somehow the name, as a good teacher knows, has power. In fact, when you know the name of a child or a person, in the ancient world, the thought was you had some control over that person. So Moses, his reality has been turned upside down. He's feeling a little queasy about this encounter with this holy mystery, and he wants to get some kind of control over it. "Tell me your name." Remember that Adam got to name all the creatures of God, all the animals, which meant that he had some ability to master the creatures that God created. And when Jesus encounters the demons, they want to know who he is. So, there's an attempt to try to control the mystery of God. So Moses is trying to put God into a box. All right, let me ask a question. If I were to ask you, who is God for you? And you had to put it in a phrase or a name, what name or phrase would you give?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute, because we're about to hear that revelation of the name. Anybody have any other names or descriptions? Father.
Lover of my soul.
Lover of my soul.
Lord.
Lord. Beloved. Lots of relational language here.
Jehovah.
Jehovah. All right, so one person made the observation, the God that you know and understand is not God. The God you know and understand is not God. It's impossible to make God smaller than our minds. So if our minds know and understand God, God is smaller than our brains. And we can know something of the mystery of God. All right, so Moses is trying to control this encounter with this holy mystery. What is your name? What does the Lord tell him? God replied, I am who I am. What kind of an answer is that? When it's spelled out in its Hebrew consonants, it's YHWH. Sometimes in English we say Yahweh. So that's the tetragrammaton, 4 great letters that signify I am who I am. I am. It can also have a future tense to it. I am who I am. It can also say I will be who I will be. So Moses, it's now and in the future. I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. What kind of an answer is that, by the way? Is God basically saying to Moses, oh no, you're not controlling this encounter. So the revelation of God's name remains, the mystery of God remains intact. God remains sovereign. You're not capturing me in a way that you can fully understand it, Moses. No, you're not controlling this encounter with the Holy One. So God replied, I am who I am. Then he added, this is what you shall tell the Israelites. I am sent me to you. God spoke further to Moses, thus you shall say, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, my title for all generations. So then he goes on to talk about he's concerned about them again, thus they will heed your message, and so forth and so on. Now, is Moses ready to go, now that he knows the name of God? But, Moses says, suppose they will not believe me, nor listen to my plea. For they may say, the Lord did not appear to you. So he gives Moses some signs to use. A staff that will turn into a serpent. He gives Moses some things to do. Moses said, O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor recently, nor now that you've spoken to your servant. I'm slow of speech and tongue. And then the Lord says, okay, I'll send Aaron. He's going to be your spokesperson. You notice all the different ways Moses is trying to get out of the call of God here. And then he says, I'll send Moses. And then Moses finally says, please, send someone else. And God says, you go. So in the end, this partnership between God and humanity, it begins with God's great initiative. And God won't stop until he gets Moses to come along on this great adventure. So it's a profound moment of what we might call revelation. Now, I will tell you this. In the beginning, God's people had this holy encounter with the mystery of God. And I mentioned to you that most ancient cultures were polytheistic. They believed that there were many gods. But Israel, early in its history, did believe that there were other gods, but they were going to worship the Lord their God alone. This is called henotheism. So there may be other gods out there, the gods of the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Hittites, but you are to worship the Lord your God alone. Him alone shall you adore. So there, in the primitive beliefs of Israel, there was an awareness there may be other divine realities, but we're going to worship the Lord alone. Later that gets refined, and they realize that the other gods don't really exist at all. There is only one God, what we call today monotheism. What we call one ultimate reality. So this one reality of God, we would say the heart of God is a God of compassionate care for humanity, willing to engage in the liberation of the human person and partnering with us to do it. So we learn a lot about God in this dramatic first encounter with the holy mystery of the burning bush. It's also interesting that the fire of God is like a fire, but it doesn't destroy. It brightens, it illuminates, it burns, but it's not destructive. So it's a powerful set of images through which God reveals himself. All right, questions about that first glimpse into this encounter with the holy mystery of God? All right, one of the great dangers for God's people throughout their history was that they would abandon the Lord their God and worship idols. Something that is not really worth worshiping. It's not an ultimate reality, but they turned it into one. So someone made the observation, to whom your heart adheres is your God. So if you have to ask yourself what's most important in my life, that becomes your God. Is that worthy of being God for you? If your money is the most important thing in your life, is that worthy of divine status for you? Does it demand your all? Would you be willing to give everything for that money? Is that your top value in life? If so, if money matters more than anything else, money has become your God. That means it's become an idol that will destroy you in the long run. What other kinds of things become idols for people? Another person sometimes. If I expect another human being to fill up everything inside of me and they can't do it, I've made that person an idol. Or you raised up your phone. So sometimes people now use their technology or it's our way of connecting in the modern world, isn't it? Yeah, that becomes our God. As soon as we leave home and we don't have it, what do we feel? Anxiety. I'm not going to be safe without my phone. It's my God now. It's going to protect me, right? Keep me connected. What else? What are the other idols in our world today?
Family.
All right, family sometimes. Yeah, family first no matter what, even if they're wrong. Or sick or destructive. We close the wagons, this is top dog. The more dangerous thing I find often is turning ourselves into God. That I'm the most important thing in the world, and I make myself the idol. That everybody else is second to me. That's self-centeredness. That's the ultimate, I think, idolatry. And everything else kind of bundles into that. Well, does the universe really revolve around me? That's the question I have to ask. If I've chosen myself for a God, I've chosen a very poor God in some ways. And I only have to try that out for a short period of time to begin to discover how destructive it is to live with me as the center of things. So, all right, so what Moses discovered was what happened to him in Egypt when he saw the Egyptian killing or harming that innocent Hebrew slave, and he grew angry and acted. Something in the heart of Moses was like God. Now, maybe we can't say he should have killed the guy and buried him, but the movement in his heart toward, it's not right that some bully should harm a weaker person, that's wrong. That intuition in the heart of Moses reflects the heart of God, doesn't it? But Moses is also very human, and he becomes afraid, and runs away until the holy mystery of God calls him back. God doesn't forget what happened in his heart at the beginning, and he knows he can use that in partnership with him to do great things. The relationship, by the way, if you read the whole story between God and Moses, is one of the most interesting and profound relationships in the whole Old Testament. There are times when God says, I'm done with this people, Moses, I'm going to wipe them out. And Moses says to God, God, they're your people, why should you wipe them out? What are all the nations going to think? You couldn't save them from Egypt, and now you're going to wipe them out? So Moses would sometimes have these conversations with God, and as the Old Testament says, withstood God in the breach. Basically said, God, this is not right. And at other times, Moses would get tired and say, I'm done. I'm not going to lead this people anymore. They're driving me crazy. And God would have to say, wait a minute, you said you would be faithful, and I'm calling you back to your fidelity. So there is a real relationship that takes place with the holy mystery of God. So as you think about who God is for you, or if you've thought about these fundamental questions, what is the nature of ultimate reality for you? Does it have a face? So we as Christians, if we believe this holy mystery with God through Moses is real, then there's something very logical in a strange paradoxical way about that in the fullness of time when humanity couldn't be brought back, that God himself would say, I have to enter into the story myself. I'm now going to have to become human. I'm going to have to be fully present in the human situation. This partnership with Moses, that was okay, but it didn't solve the ultimate problem of humanity. So I love the way the Gospel of John puts it. The Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and pitched his tent, literally, among us. So a God who, when we're walking through the path of life, knows that we're off the path and lost and can't find our way back. So he pitches his tent and comes down on the trail with us to walk with us back on the path. That's the kind of God we believe would take on humanity. So that the God of all the universe, ultimately worthy of trust, is also a God, because of his heartfelt compassion and fidelity and trueness to humanity, is willing to become incarnate, and not only to be born and become one of us, but he is also willing to go all the way to the cross and die for us, and rise from the dead, and thus destroy the death that kept humanity in prison. So this is a God who will stop at nothing to save humanity, to redeem us. And I love the way that Jesus talks about that. It's like the shepherd who knows that there is one lost sheep, and he will leave the 99 behind and go in search of that lost one until he finds it. And when that God finds that sheep, that shepherd, he will put it on his shoulders and bring it back with great joy and say, rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep. If you've never lost anyone important to you, you might not get the full import of that parable. But if you've lost someone who matters a great deal to you, then you know what it is like to want to go in search of that lost one until you find it, until you find him or her, and he or she is okay again. So that's the heart of God that we Christians believe in. So I will also add, and we'll be reflecting a lot more on the person of Jesus and also the gift of the Holy Spirit. But in the course of the unfolding of how God chose to become human, we realize that God is not only what we call Father, but God is also Son and Spirit. So a mystery of Trinity, yet one God. And that in itself is what we call an absolute mystery that we will never be able to fully understand with our brains. Even in heaven, face to face with the mystery of God, we will never fully comprehend how God can be both one and three. But that's the core mystery of the Trinity that we Christians believe in. So, and what does Jesus say in the Gospel of John when pressed to define God? God, Jesus says, is love. All right, I want to say a word about language. All right, y'all gave me some great images, right? I heard Father, I heard Lord, I heard Lover, I heard Beloved. What else did I hear? Who is God? Yahweh, which is the sacred name of God. Jehovah, by the way, is just a corruption of Yahweh. It's the way they translated those 4 great letters. Who is God? Holy Spirit.
Is he also Son?
Son.
Shepherd.
Shepherd. One. For those of you who are religious already, believers, who is God for you? If you had to put a name or word. God.
Savior.
Savior. Any others?
He with a capital H.
He with a capital H. Comforter. Any other words or names I would put down that you would say?
Rock.
Rock.
Divine.
Divine.
Protector.
Protector.
Redeemer.
All right, Redeemer.
Energy.
Energy.
Light.
Light.
Trinity.
Trinity.
Wisdom.
Wisdom.
Creator.
Creator. So, the theologians say every word that we use to describe God has what we call an analogical character, which means that you talk about 3 movements. First, there is the positive way. So, in the positive way, we describe the mystery of God using human language, which we just did on the board, right? God is a rock, God is light, God is shepherd, God is father, God is love. It's our attempt to use human language to describe the infinite mystery of God. So there's a positive dimension to the use of language. But theologians say you have to take a second step, which they call the negative way. So you might start by saying God is rock. What does that mean? It's language that expresses something about the mystery of God, but then you say at the second level, but God is really not rock. God is not rock like granite outside. So in a sense, you have to go back and deny everything you said. God is Father, but He's not a Father like our earthly fathers. All of our earthly fathers, some of them are much better than others, but are limited and human and make mistakes and falter and fail and that would inadequately describe who God is. God is shepherd, okay, but not like the shepherds out in Bethlehem who are watching their sheep and get tired and want to go home because they're, spent for the night. Now, so every word we use to describe the mystery of God is a limited way of trying to express what we call infinite mystery. St. Augustine said, he was walking along the beach, I'm paraphrasing, and this little boy has got a hole in the sand near the ocean, and he's taking his little bucket with water, and he's pouring water from the sea into the hole that he has dug. And Augustine says, what are you doing? He says, I'm putting the sea in the hole. And Augustine laughs at it. He says, that's like trying to put the mystery of God into the human mind. It's too big. It will never go into our human mind. So that's why everything we say about God, in a way, is not true in a sense. And I will also add real quickly, even something as profound as God as Father, which we see in Scripture, well, if you grew up with a father who was unreliable and or abusive, you might hear the word Father and cringe. It might be hard for you to connect God as Father. That might not be a good way for you to speak of God until who God as Father is purified for you. So whatever kind of father God is, it's not like that kind of a father who would abuse or be inconsistent in love or respect for children. So we speak about then the third book, which is the way of eminence. That God is Father in a way that no earthly father is truly Father. And in fact, every earthly father, at their best, is participating a tiny bit in the infinite goodness of the fatherness of God. You could put it that way. So in that sense, all of our language about God has to be purified and refined. And yet, because we're human beings, and we have to be able to understand something, we have to speak and use language about God. Better to speak than not to speak. But I will also add, we say God is light. Is that a powerful and beautiful way of speaking of who God is? Absolutely. Would it also be okay to say God is darkness? Perhaps. What does darkness mean? Or an absence of light, or when I go out into a dark night, there might be something mysterious about it, something that I don't understand or can't comprehend. So we speak about the darkness of God, it might be the mystery of God that our human brain can't fully understand yet. And I can say God is rock, but I could also say God is water, living water, which is very unlike rock, but it describes something about the mystery of God. So, and I could also speak of God with the language of the tenderness of a mother, like a mother hen who watches out for her little chicks. So when Jesus speaks about God going in search of lost humanity, he talks about a father welcoming home as somebody else. He talks about a woman looking for a coin, doesn't he? So both male and female are created in the image and likeness of God. So both men and women reveal something of the mystery of God in our own unique way. God transcends as beyond human sexuality. So God is infinite mystery, and because God is infinite mystery, all of our human words about God are limited. Unless we say something like God is not simply powerful, but we use a phrase like all-powerful, omnipotent, which is a way of saying God is not powerful in the way that I'm powerful. God has some power far beyond her that is infinitely greater than any created power. So one has to ask the question, I suppose, if you're searching, who or what kind of God would you have to believe in order to trust your life fully into the care of that God? What qualities would that God have to have? Have you ever made a list? It's a good project. In other words, if I'm going to give my life and my will into the care of a God of some sort, what kind of qualities would that God have to have for me to trust that I would actually do that and surrender my will and my life into the care of such a God. It's worth thinking about that, because sometimes our notions of God are not very good. I have a professor in theology who said he would discover that some people had what he called an ambush theology. They thought that God was waiting till they messed up just to get them. So a God who is waiting for us to mess up so he could get us. Well, that's not God and our understanding of God. And if you had that belief about God, would you want to entrust your life into the care of such a God? All right, questions? Yes?
So I think the mystery of God, and you said it begs the question. I think one of the questions about that is who, what, why created God, I guess. Is before God, what was there, or was it always God? I guess it's kind of what led to that.
All right, so
Well, I don't know the answer, but
who or what created God? Our belief is that God is eternal. There never was a time when God was not. God is the uncreated creator. All that exists comes from the creative power of God, but God's self is not created. And anything that would be created is less than that which created it. So if something created God, whatever created God is greater than God, therefore that original creator who created God would be God, not God. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that which is ultimate can't be surpassed. And that means that God and our understanding of things is truly transcendent or ultimate, dependent upon nothing, and yet all things depend upon God. I always say, you know, one of the approaches about faith is that it is an act of trust. It's a leap into the dark. And the trust is, when I take that leap, will I be held by this ultimate mystery or not? That's what I have to decide. And if I have to live a certain way, will I live in such a way that I trust such a thing or that I will not trust? If I don't trust an ultimate reality, then I end up trying to trust in something that's limited. Then I'm going to fall back on my cell phone, or my money, or myself, or another person. I'm going to be looking for something in my life that's going to be the foundation. And I have to ask myself, is that a worthy foundation for my life in the end? That's why when Jesus says in John's Gospel, you know, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Thomas says, we don't know the way. What do you mean? Thomas, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you've seen my human face, you've seen the ultimate mystery. Any other questions? All right, we're almost at 8 o'clock, so we're going to go back to our tables for discussions. I think there are questions waiting at the table.